This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Politico's annual Sustainability Future Week. My name is Jan Chański, and I am Politico's Senior Policy Editor, and I oversee the three teams that cover climate, energy, sustainability, and mobility. We'll be spending the next 3 days digging into the EU's path to becoming more sustainable. We'll be covering everything from climate change to a cleaner energy mix and how to insulate buildings. The topics also include tech and sustainability, the circular economy, raw materials, and the end of the internal combustion engine. From today to Thursday, we've got excellent guests for you. We've got politicians, lobbyists, NGOs, and business leaders. Today, we'll hear from US Vice President Al Gore, and we'll also hear from Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson and International Energy Agency Chief Fatih Birol. They'll be taking part in a series of interviews. We'll also hear from top-level panels and discussion groups. The scale of what we're doing over the next 3 days in some sense mirrors what the EU is trying to achieve. The main headline of the Green Deal is to become climate neutral by 2050, but the program also aims to end all pollution by the same year and to slash waste and have a circular economy by mid-century. That involves radical changes to where we live, how we travel, and how we work. All these issues have been made even more acute by Russia's attack on Ukraine, which highlights the geopolitical risks on relying for energy for the Kremlin. Today's session focuses on hitting carbon neutrality by 2050. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, both in person and virtually, for making it to today's session. I'd also like to thank our partners for making this summit possible. Our leading partners are Coca-Cola in Europe, GE, and SQM. Our presenting partners are Braskem, Cefic, Google, MAN Truck and Bus, Ørsted, PepsiCo, and PGE. Our networking partners are Chiesi and 3M. We want to make this event interactive, and you can only ask questions through the Swap Card platform. You can get the instructions for that on our event website. If you're already on the platform, you're able to chat with other attendees. You can ask questions in the question box to the right of the screen if you're on a desktop, and below the live stream if you're on a mobile. If you're joining us in person, you can ask your questions via the Swap Card, and you just have to scan the rotating QR code on the screens. If you're up for tweeting, which is a potentially risky proposition in today's environment to Twitter, you can tweet using the hashtag #PoliticoSustainability. Maybe you'll even get an answer from Elon. Because the green transition is a systemic one, arts and culture can also support implementing this change. And that's why we're happy to feature the art of Janina Rossiter, who's here at Sustainable Future Week. And we also welcome cartoonist Esther Favero, who will be highlighting, sketching highlights of the debates. We're also happy to let you know that in the spirit of sustainability, the little name tags that you have around your necks are 100% sustainable seed badges. And if you plant them in your gardens after today's session, they will eventually grow into flowers. Before we begin our opening interview with former US Vice President Al Gore, I'd like to give the floor to Nikos Koumetis, who's the president of Coca-Cola in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Nikos Koumetis, and I'm the president of the Coca-Cola Company in Europe. I'm honored to kick off this great event for the second year in a row. We have been producing drinks in Europe since 1919, and we take pride in being a company with strong European roots. Today, with our bottling partners, we directly employ 50,000 people in more than 40 European markets. And our business creates almost 500,000 in direct jobs across our value chain. We are here today because we share Europe's ambitions and challenges. Climate change is at the forefront, not just as extreme weather events, but as a social issue that threatens the livelihood of those who are already the most vulnerable. Europe's challenge of ensuring a just transition to a climate-neutral future that benefits everyone is also our shared challenge. So ensuring a just transition is about more than business. We must bring people along and ensure they, too, build resilience to handle change, especially young people. Today, 40% of young people fear having children due to climate change. Over half of them think humanity is really doomed. Earlier this year, we partnered with Debating Europe in a project to better understand how to overcome eco-anxiety. We found that a main worry among young people was that climate change will lead to increased inequality. They also urged businesses and governments to work closer together and to bring people along in this process of change. At the Coca-Cola Company, we want to grow our business the right way, not just the easy way. So last year, together with our bottling partners, we announced our 2040 net zero commitment. Our 2040 net zero plan is essentially a plan to build resilience by reducing the climate impact in our business, value chain, and the communities we serve. This is challenging, but the sense of urgency to decarbonize our economy is really growing. And with a war in Europe affecting us all, as energy supplies are under pressure and inflation is threatening economic stability, we really must keep pushing forward. Today, 80% of all the energy used in the 80 plants of our bottling partners in Europe comes from renewable sources. We also help build resilience across our value chain. In pilot projects in the UK, France, Spain, Italy, and Greece, in partnership with bottling partner CCP, we are helping small restaurants, bars, and cafes decarbonize their business. With our bottling partner Coca-Cola HBC, we are investing in the upskilling of young people to train and mentor them so they develop skills of the future linked to sustainability and digitization. And we are actively working with our suppliers and customers to find employment opportunities in our own business and value chain. A bright example of that is our regeneration project in Greece. As a leading industry player, we have been working with industry partners in CSR Europe to develop a roadmap to help businesses integrate the European Commission's work on a just transition in their strategies, helping to ensure that no one is left behind. We encourage the Commission to consider establishing a business alliance of just transition to promote the idea further. Learning from the youth, what stood out for me was a recommendation to develop a new, positive narrative. Young Europeans understand the dangers, but they ask to be inspired and to be informed of the co-benefits of climate action, helping us in this way move away from the polarized debate on climate. So that is our task. Our company's purpose is to refresh the world and make a difference. Our iconic brands stand for inclusivity and for hope for a better shared future. We are here to do our part and to partner for the challenges ahead. We look forward to the discussions over the next few days to learn and to be inspired. Thank you.
Hello everybody, I'm Carl Matheson. I'm Politico's Senior Climate Correspondent. Welcome to everybody here in the audience in Brussels and online. As my editor, Jan, said, you can ask questions, but both online and offline only through the Swap Card platform. So you'll see that on the website, and you can please do send in your questions for former Vice President Gore and for our panelists coming up. We want an interactive live discussion through the day. So thank you so much for that. And I will move on now to our first speaker, who kind of needs no introduction in the climate space, but he has been at the forefront of activism on climate change since long before it was cool. He's pushed at the very top of government in the US. He's inspired and starred in a paradigm-shifting film, An Inconvenient Truth, in 2006. He chairs an asset management fund focused on climate-friendly investments. He founded an independent global emissions monitor recently, and he's trained tens of thousands of activists to hold governments and companies around the world to account over their inaction and drive solutions in their communities. Former US Vice President Al Gore, welcome to Politico's Sustainable Future Week.
Thank you very much, Carl. Great to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join.
It's an absolute pleasure. We've both been in Egypt recently at COP27, and one thing struck me about the deal that was struck at the end of the talks. One line that said, "We need to move $4 to $6 trillion per year in clean energy investments in order to get us to where we need to be going." You're, among the many things that I listed in the introduction, a money guy, and so I wanted to ask you to give me a sense of how you felt about coming out of COP27. Did it move the dial from where we're talking about billions to trillions?
Well, it represented some important, if small, steps in the right direction. First of all, of course, the historic agreement on what's referred to as loss and damage was seen as a victory for developing countries that are suffering a great deal from the consequences of the climate crisis. And of course, the details have to be filled in, perhaps at COP28 next year. There was also an encouraging new strong consensus on the reform of the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks. They must play a much larger role in making it possible for developing countries to gain access to capital markets. I've used this example before, but it illustrates the nature of this problem, Carl. If you want to build a large solar farm in Nigeria, it will provide the cheapest, most competitive electricity available and would be very profitable. However, you will have to pay interest rates 7 times higher than the interest rates paid by European countries and by the US. And that, of course, just completely shuts them out of access to capital markets. And it's effectively insane where the global allocation of capital is concerned. So that has to be changed. And I think the outcome in COP27 moves us pretty decisively toward the reforms that are needed. And I would expect that at the spring meeting of the World Bank, you will see a number of shareholders pushing very aggressively for this change. Of course, I've called also for a new head of the World Bank. The current head, appointed by the previous U.S. president, has been a vocal public climate denier. He now says he has changed his view, but the actions and behavior of the World Bank under his leadership has been just pathetic, where the world's need to address this crisis is concerned. Now, finishing my response to your question, the main outcome from COP27 that we needed was not achieved. And of course, that means reducing the emissions of global warming pollution that are causing this crisis. We're putting another 162 million tons of this heat trapping pollution into the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet every single day. We're using the troposphere as an open sewer, free of charge. If you have a lot of gaseous waste that's going to threaten the future of humanity, don't worry about it. Just dump it into the atmosphere, and we'll figure out decades from now what to do. But nothing was done there, and that's really a problem, and that has to be changed. And of course, one reason nothing was done is that petrostates have a kind of veto over anything that's agreed, and they wouldn't agree, Saudi Arabia and Russia and the others. And the fossil fuel companies have effective control over the formation of policies related to climate in many countries. Thankfully, we broke that control in my country, in the U.S., with President Biden and the Congress. But in a great many countries around the world, the polluters themselves actually have effective control over government policies. And that includes requiring taxpayers in countries around the world to subsidize the destruction of our future at a rate 37 times larger than the subsidies now available for renewable energy, to which we must make a transition rapidly.
I just want to bring you back to your comments on David Malpass, the president of the World Bank. It does seem that there's not an appetite from the shareholders or the US government, who both, have a big say in his future, to remove him. Do you understand why that is, and do you see that? You obviously see it as being a mistake. Is that on the US administration?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that there's not an appetite for that change. I think that in the immediate run-up to the U.S. elections, there was an evident reluctance to initiate such a change. But I will not at all be surprised if in the run-up to the spring meetings, there is pressure for him to leave. As to why there has not been more movement in that direction, it's not that complicated. Since Bretton Woods in 1944, the United States has had the privilege of naming the head of the World Bank, and Europe has had the privilege of naming the head of the IMF. And there's been a long-standing concern that if the U.S. moved that position around just because there was a U.S. election, that might threaten the U.S.'s ability to maintain control of that appointment. So I think that's the main reason there's been a reluctance to tinker with it, and there's not that much time left in his term. So I think that that's what's been going on. But we do need new leadership. It's not a personal matter with one individual, but that institution should be playing a significant role. And that means we do need new leadership there, and the shareholders of the bank need to install new policies and a much bolder approach to taking the extra risk off the top of the capital stack when a country like Nigeria or other developing countries are trying to gain access to capital. There's political risk, there's rule of law risk, there's corruption risk, there's climate risk, and there's all kinds of additional risks that you don't face if you're lending money to an OECD nation. And that has to be dealt with because the $4 to $5 trillion per year the world needs to spend to finance this transition is urgently needed.
One of the things that developing countries cite, and I guess another way of talking about mitigating against these financial risks, is through also using public funding, public finance, to underwrite or loan countries like Nigeria, for example, money to take on these projects and at lower interest rates, at lower risk. One idea that came up at COP27 was an idea that's been formulated by John Kerry around using a carbon credit system that would see US companies and potentially other companies around the world offset their emissions in order to move money into developing countries and energy projects. Does that carry some risks? We've seen a lot about junk offsets and difficulties in carbon credit systems. Do you understand why John Kerry is moving into this ground, and whether you see it as a dangerous ground to be moving into?
Well, I'm going to respond to that question, but first of all, let me deal with the overall context. If you look at this renewable energy revolution, last year, calendar year 2021, if you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide, 90% of it was renewable. As Fatih Birol, who is one of your guests later, has said at the IEA, Solar energy is the king of energy markets. It's the cheapest electricity in the history of the world. Of course, we should be making that transition. And we would if the fossil fuel companies didn't have such control over the policy-making process in so many countries, again, forcing taxpayers to subsidize more and more fossil fuel. But how did how did all of that renewable energy get financed? Well, 86% of it came from the private markets. And in North America, in the US and Canada, 96% came from the private markets. But in Africa, only 14% comes from private markets and 86% from public funding. So the overall amount is much, much, much lower, and it's not anywhere nearly enough. So now to your question about offsets. Along with many others, I'm withholding judgment on the plan that my friend John Kerry mentioned in Egypt until the full details are available. I know they're still being developed, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for John. We've worked together for a long time, and there's no doubt that we need to rapidly mobilize private finance, particularly in those countries and regions, as I've mentioned, where the funding for these projects is so challenging to acquire. But at the same time, carbon markets can be an incredibly challenging tool, especially when it comes to assessing the integrity and validity and what's called the additionality of offsets. Additionality, as I'm sure you know very well, Carl, and many in your audience do as well, that's the principle that says an offset's not valid unless it's something that would not have been financed otherwise anyway. And with the continuing rapid cost reduction curve for both solar and wind, these renewable energy projects are so profitable now that most of them are going to be financed anyway. So John and I have an open dialogue about how to drive climate action, and he shared some information about this emerging plan. But as I said, I'm waiting to see the full details before making a judgment about it.
In terms of giving us a sense of what really is going on around the world, you've launched a new initiative, Climate Trace, which I mentioned in your intro as a kind of emissions monitor from trying to pick up on point sources of pollution all around the world. Could you just describe maybe like why this doesn't exist already, which I think some of our viewers might wonder, and then what are the potential applications that this could be used for as you build it out?
Well, thank you so much for asking about it, Carl. You know, there's an old saying in business, you can only manage what you can measure. And in the 30 years, the world has attempted to negotiate reductions in the emissions of this heat-trapping pollution. We've never known where all that pollution is coming from. And you ask, why haven't we known? Well, there's a simple answer. We can measure with the new satellites and large specialized instruments, we can measure sources of methane from orbit, from orbiting satellites. We cannot measure directly CO2 because the so-called signal to noise ratio it gets in the way. There's the atmosphere is saturated with 414 parts per million of CO2, and there are so many sources. We still rely, after all, on fossil energy for 80% of the world's energy. So you cannot measure that directly. What's brand new and what the Climate Trace Coalition has provided is the use of artificial intelligence to use multiple streams of data in order to accurately identify and measure all of the significant emission sources of global warming pollution, CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, and the others. What that means is we measure, we take information across multiple wavelengths from 300 existing satellites, from air, sea, and land-based sensors, from multiple other data sources, including the internet data sources that are available. And the artificial intelligence experts in our coalition and the data scientists, NGOs, and universities compile all of that data into algorithms that become very accurately predictive of how much emissions, how many emissions are coming from each source. We just published the first and only independent facility level inventory of the global warming pollution sources worldwide. We started with the 72,000 largest sources. The largest of all, by the way, is in the Permian Basin in Texas and in my country. Second largest is a similar site in Russia. But you can see them all. You can go to climatetrace.org right now and look at your own country, look at your own city, look at your own region. You can find by category all of the significant emission sources. We already have basically all of them, but we could not process all of the information in time for COP27. So we started with the 72,000 largest. By the end of next year, we will have essentially all of them, not backyard barbecues. There's a long tail of very tiny sites, but we will have all of the significant, medium-sized, and even smaller emission sites. And the reason that's important is that, you know, 3/4 of all the emissions are coming from countries that have pledged to reach net zero by 2050. Now they have the ability to see where it's coming from. So many businesses have pledged to reach net zero. Now their supply chain managers can pick and choose from suppliers and subcontractors that have lower rather than higher emissions. A lot of financial institutions have made similar pledges. NGOs can use it to prioritize their campaigning activities. Researchers and journalists can use it. There have already been hundreds of stories around the world based on the Climate Trace inventory. It stands, incidentally, TRACE for tracking real-time atmospheric carbon emissions. And it's gratifying to those of us in this coalition to see so many journalists all around the world using the data to identify exactly where the largest polluting sites are in their region, in their city, in their nation.
Well, as a journalist, I think this is an amazing source of information, but also as an Australian and one of Brussels' most prolific barbecuers, I'm kind of glad that you haven't reached that level of detail quite yet. Well,
I've seen a number of stories in Australia, by the way, Carl, and even your home region, Tasmania.
Indeed. Well, I'm looking forward to digging through the data. I wanted to maybe move us into the Inflation Reduction Act, which has, been kind of getting chewed on here for a little while now in Brussels. And in the last few weeks, we've seen a real sense of disquiet emerge, I think, about the potential impact on European industry, especially around the Made in America provisions for electric vehicles, for example. The European Commission has called it clearly discriminatory. And also, Green Deal Chief, EU Green Deal Chief Frans Timmermans, has kind of expressed his sense that maybe the US isn't listening to the pain that the EU is in. This is coming on top of the energy crisis, and so industry here is suffering. And I just wondered, do you understand these complaints, and do you think the US needs to respond to where the pain that the EU is expressing and the disquiet over these measures?
Well, I know the discussions are underway, and there will be discussions this week in Washington, and I hope that they can reach some new understandings. But I have to say that the Inflation Reduction Act overall is a truly historic accomplishment. It's the most significant, by far the largest climate legislation ever passed by any country in all of history. And it took a great deal of political acumen on the part of the President Biden and the Democratic leaders of the House and Senate to get it done. Now, the elements of it that you're referring to have to do with accusations of protectionism And of course, the forums in the WTO will be energized, and I'm sure there'll be active discussions. And as I said, perhaps the talks that are now underway will move us toward an understanding that will ease the concerns that Europe has expressed. Let me say in passing, Franz Timmermans is a global hero, in my opinion. He's one of the great climate policymakers on our planet.
Of course, the talks that you're referring to is French President Emmanuel Macron's in Washington meeting with Joe Biden today, I believe. So those discussions are ongoing. But is there a sense maybe from Washington where you think this is exactly what you've been asking us to do, act on climate change, and now we're doing it and you're complaining?
Well, it's not as simple as that, as you know. And of course, Europe for years has been talking about a carbon border adjustment. That idea is one that I support, actually. Many in my country do not, but I think that's an excellent idea. And I think that the U.S., having moved aggressively forward with this legislation, hopes that other nations, including the European Union, will take even more aggressive steps on their own to match what the U.S. has done.
The European Union has also recently moved into ground that you've worked in for a long time with investment funds, and they've brought out their sustainable investment taxonomy. One of the most controversial aspects of that, as you know, is the inclusion of natural gas as a transition fuel. What do you think about that, as both as an investor but also a climate activist?
Well, I was disappointed when natural gas was included as a renewable fuel. Of course, it's not a renewable fuel. There's been a widespread myth about fossil gas. Even the term natural gas was a marketing term invented by the industry back in the 1930s. It's almost all methane. And it is true that if you burn methane, or what's called natural gas, to generate electricity or heat, you're going to directly emit only half of the CO2 that would be emitted by burning coal for the same amount of electricity or heat. That's true. However, almost every part of the fossil gas supply and production chain leaks methane. And unfortunately, each molecule of methane traps heat 82.5 times more powerfully than each molecule of CO2. So if only 2 or 3% leaks, then it's worse for the climate than burning coal. And more than 2 to 3% apparently does leak. Every time they measure it, they find more. And there's reckless emission of methane during the production process, the flaring of gas as well. It leaks in the pipelines, it leaks in the in-use equipment, and the hydrological fracking process is an enormous source of methane. Now, it does have a shorter residence time in the atmosphere, only 10 to 12 years as compared to an average of 100 years for the CO2 molecules. The actual math is impossibly complicated, but the scientists say that 100 years is a valid figure on average. But if you invest heavily in these gas pipelines and production systems, then you're going to be constantly replenishing it. And we face the further risk that the frozen soils of the Arctic region, as they thaw, will begin to release such high volumes of methane and CO2 that this element of the global warming process could potentially spin out of control. It's a real danger. There are a number of tipping points, so-called, that we're taking a dangerous risk in approaching. So time is of the essence. You've heard of the time value of money. we need to be talking about the time value of carbon. And if you focus on the time value of carbon, it will lead you to not look at methane gas or fossil gas as a so-called bridge fuel. It is a danger in and of itself, especially since this historic, unprecedented revolution in the cheapest energy in the history of the world, solar and wind, is advancing. And now we see the very real prospect of being able to use the surplus amounts of renewable electricity, the flip side of intermittency, to produce green hydrogen from water. I know there are many risks and many challenges, but I think that that has opened up a new avenue for the high heat processes, particularly. And the European Union has really taken the lead, Germany in particular, in developing green hydrogen.
Mr. Gore, we have one question and we have about 3 minutes left, and I want to ask you to finish. I want to make sure there's space for you to give us a kind of rallying call for hope, because I feel like we need that to start off our Sustainable Future Week. But this question is really an interesting one from Hitchup Baccarat. He or she, I'm not sure, it says, they say the ethical implications of climate change, with a particular focus on the issue of global and intergenerational justice, are a pressing issue. Is there a moral and action-oriented compass for policymakers in these extreme circumstances of climate change and environmental degradation? Where is the compass pointing? Where can policymakers look for their moral guidance?
Well, the survival of our civilization is potentially at risk. We have seen in the last decade, just from the extreme climate-related weather events, $2.5 trillion in damages, which is an increase over the previous decade of $1 trillion. It was 1.5 in the previous decade. And it's very clear that it's getting worse. I mentioned we're putting 162 million tons up there every day using the atmosphere as an open sewer, and the accumulation of the heat trapping pollution there has now reached a point where every single day we trap as much extra heat in the Earth's system as would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours. It's reckless and insane to continue this process. And yes, the fossil fuel companies have a lot of political power, and they control many politicians with a century-old network of political and financial strength. But slowly, people are breaking free from that. In the words of America's greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, we have to disenthrall ourselves. We have to think anew because our case is new. And now we have the means to save ourselves. Someone said, well, if God wanted us to rely on solar energy, would have put a big fusion reactor in the sky. Well, we have one. And we get as much energy from the sun in 1 hour as the entire global economy uses for an entire year. So as we increase the fraction of that enormous energy that we can use, then we have the ability to save ourselves. So what is the North Star? A focus on the survival of humanity, the survival of our civilization, and the well-being of not only our children and grandchildren, but of the present generation, because already, particularly in the developing world, we are seeing catastrophic harms that we can begin to stop. One final point, Carl. In the last IPCC report, for all the dire warnings, there's also some good news. If we do reach true net zero, then temperatures on Earth will stop going up with a lag time of as little as 3 to 5 years. That's amazing. And if we stay at true net zero, then approximately half of all the human-caused CO2 in the atmosphere will fall out of the atmosphere into the upper ocean and the vegetation in as little as 25 to 30 years. So yes, there's dire danger facing us. It really is the most serious challenge we've ever faced. But we have the solutions available to us. What we have to put together is sufficient political will. And as the late Nelson Mandela once said famously, it's always impossible until it's done. We have the ability to do it. We just need to summon the political will and get on with it.
Mr. Gore, thank you so much. You've given us our marching orders for the week and the decade and the century. So I appreciate you so much for coming onto our summit and opening it with these words, and for discussing with us all of these different elements of how we're responding to climate change and what fell out of COP27. I know the audience in the room has really appreciated this and been enthralled by your words. So thank you so much, and hope to talk again soon.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone.
To the audience members in the room, please do remain seated. We're going to run straight into our panel discussion on the delicate weave of climate geopolitics. So please hang about for that as we just reset the stage.